They say that money can buy anything, a view, a reputation, even the law itself. My neighbor, a tech millionaire named Sterling Vance, certainly believed that. He looked at my century-old Garry Oaks and didn't see living history. He saw an obstacle to his infinity pool. He called me a bitter old man and laughed while his crew turned my property into a graveyard of stumps while I was away at my mother's funeral. He thought a $5,000 fine was a small price to pay for his perfect 180-degree view of the Sound. He was wrong. He didn't just cut down trees. He cut down the only thing holding the earth beneath his $5 million mansion together. You see, Sterling made one fatal mistake. He didn't check my resume. I'm not just a neighbor. I'm a retired maritime surveyor and a specialist in coastal land use law. By the time I was done with him, he didn't just lose his money. He lost his house, his land, and his pride. This isn't just a story about tree law. It's a story about how one man's arrogance triggered a landslide that buried his entire life. If you've ever dealt with an entitled neighbor who thinks they're above the law, sit tight. Because you're about to watch a masterclass in scorched earth retribution. Welcome to ThreadVerse. My name is David. I'm 62 years old, and for the last quarter century, I've lived in a modest cedar-shingled house on the edge of a cliff in the Pacific Northwest. My home isn't a mansion, but it has something no amount of Silicon Valley money can buy: the Old Guard. The Old Guard was a cluster of 7 massive Garry Oaks. These weren't just trees. They were ancient, gnarled giants with branches that looked like the veins of the earth. They had stood on my property line for over 120 years, surviving coastal gales, forest fires, and the slow encroachment of modern developers. To me, they were my privacy, my peace, and my silent companions. In the summer, their deep green canopy cooled my deck. In the winter, they stood as stoic shields against the freezing salt spray of the Sound. For 20 years, I shared this view with Mrs. Gable, a sweet woman who loved the owls that nested in those oaks as much as I did. But 2 years ago, Mrs. Gable passed away, and the lot next door, a prime piece of coastal real estate, was bought by Sterling Vance. Sterling was the poster child for new money. He was 34, a software disruptor who had just cashed out of his third startup for more millions than he knew how to spend. He didn't just want to live by the water. He wanted to dominate it. The first time I met him, I was in my yard, pruning some rhododendrons. A matte black G-Wagon pulled into the Gable lot, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust. Sterling stepped out, wearing a linen shirt that cost more than my first car and sunglasses that hid eyes as cold as a mountain lake. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a handshake. He walked right to the edge of the property line, looked at my trees, and frowned. "These are going to be a problem," he said, his voice dripping with an arrogance that made my blood simmer. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my knees. "Excuse me? I don't think we've met. I'm David." He barely looked at me. "Sterling." "Look, Dave, these oaks, they're blocking the sight line for my new master suite. My architect is designing a floor-to-ceiling glass wall, and I need an unobstructed 180-degree panoramic view of the water. These weeds are right in the center of my frame." I leaned on my shears, staring at him. "It's David. And those weeds have been here longer than your entire family has likely been in this country. They're on my property, and they're staying there." Sterling gave a short, condescending laugh. "Look, I'm sure they have some sentimental value to an old-school guy like you. I'm prepared to be generous. I'll hire a professional crew, take them down, grind the stumps, and I'll even pay for some low-profile shrubbery for your yard. I'll even throw in $10,000 for your trouble. Win-win, right?" "The answer is no, Sterling," I said, my voice low and final. "There is no price. Those trees provide privacy for my home and habitat for a dozen species. Welcome to the neighborhood, but stay off my land." He didn't get angry, not then. He just looked at me with a pitying smile, the kind you give a child who doesn't understand the rules of a game. "Everything has a price, Dave. You're just holding out. We'll talk later." Over the next year, the Gable lot turned into a construction war zone. Sterling's vision was a monstrous 6,000-square-foot concrete and glass bunker that looked like a villain's lair from a James Bond movie. Every few months, he would corner me. 50,000, he'd say, leaning over the temporary fence. 50 grand to let me take down just the 3 biggest ones. "No, 100,000? Come on, Dave. You could buy a new house for that much. I like the one I have. And for the last time, it's David." He finally snapped. "You're being difficult for the sake of being difficult. You're standing in the way of progress. Those trees are a fire hazard anyway. They're Garry Oaks, Sterling. They're fire-resistant and protected by state law. Now, get off my property." He turned red, his neck veins bulging. "You think you can stop me? I always get what I want. One way or another. Those trees are coming down." That was the last time we spoke. For the next few months, things went strangely quiet. Sterling's mansion neared completion, and he stopped bothering me. I thought he'd finally accepted the no. I thought my trees were safe. Then, in early September, my mother passed away in Chicago. It was a sudden, heart-wrenching loss. I had to leave immediately to settle her affairs. I was gone for 10 days, 10 days of lawyers, funeral arrangements, and grief. My mind was thousands of miles away from my coastal home and my neighborly disputes. I landed back in Seattle on a Friday night, exhausted and drained. I drove home in a daze, pulled into my driveway in the dark, and went straight to bed. The next morning, I woke up to a light that was all wrong. Usually, my bedroom was filled with a soft, dappled green glow as the morning sun filtered through the branches of the old guard. But this morning, the room was blindingly bright. Harsh, yellow sunlight was pouring through my window, hitting my face with a heat I'd never felt before. My heart began to thrum with a sudden, icy dread. I stood up and walked to the window. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe. The horizon was empty. Where 7 massive, ancient Garry Oaks had stood for a century, there was now only the blue, uncaring expanse of the Pacific Ocean. I stumbled onto my deck. The ground at the property line had been pulverized by heavy machinery. All that remained of the old guard were 7 jagged, raw stumps, bleeding sap into the dirt like fresh wounds. The sawdust was so thick it looked like a pale, dusty snowfall had covered my yard. I looked up at Sterling's mansion. There he was, standing behind his floor-to-ceiling glass wall on the 2nd floor. He was wearing a silk robe, holding a cup of espresso. He saw me. He didn't look away. Instead, he raised his cup in a mocking toast and smiled. He had waited until he knew I was out of the state. He had hired a rogue crew to trespass on my land, cut down protected, century-old trees, and haul away the massive trunks before the sun could even go down. He thought he was being clever. He thought he could just pay a small fine and enjoy his million-dollar view. But as I stood there, staring at the corpses of my trees, the grief for my mother and the fury for my land fused into something cold, sharp, and architectural. Sterling Vance wanted a view. Well, I was about to give him a view of exactly how the law works when you mess with a man who knows where the bodies, and the property lines, are buried. I didn't call the police. I didn't go over there and shout. I walked into my office, sat at my desk, and opened my professional archives. You should have checked my resume, Sterling, I whispered to the quiet room. Because those trees weren't just blocking your view. They were the only thing holding up your driveway. The game was on. And unlike Sterling, I wasn't playing for money. I was playing for the land itself. I didn't storm over to Sterling's house. I didn't call the police to report a noise complaint. I didn't even shout at him across the property line. In my line of work, maritime surveying, you learn very quickly that the person who screams first is the person who has already lost the battle. Control is the only currency that matters in a high-stakes dispute. I walked into my kitchen, brewed a pot of the strongest, blackest coffee I had, and sat at my oak kitchen table. I picked up the phone and made one call. It wasn't to a friend. It was to Arthur Vance, no relation to Sterling, thank God. Arthur was a tree lawyer. Now, to most people, tree law sounds like a joke. It sounds like something you'd find on a daytime court show. But in the Pacific Northwest, tree law is the equivalent of a nuclear strike. Our state has some of the strictest timber trespass laws in the country, especially when it involves protected species like the Garry Oak. Arthur, I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. The old guard is gone. All 7 of them. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Arthur's breathing change. 7 Garry Oaks, David? You're sure? The ones on the cliff edge. Stumps, I replied. They were cut while I was in Chicago. Trespass is clear. Heavy machinery tracks on my lawn. I have photos of the canopy from 2 weeks ago and photos of the stumps from 10 minutes ago. David, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory tone. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. I'm sending a certified forensic arborist and a land surveyor to your house in 2 hours. Do not let Sterling Vance interfere with their work. If he steps on your property, call the sheriff immediately for a secondary trespass. 2 hours later, a white truck with the logo of a prestigious forestry firm pulled into my driveway. Out stepped Sarah, an arborist who looked like she'd spent more time in the woods than in a city. She was followed by 2 men carrying laser measuring equipment and GPS markers. They didn't need me to show them where the damage was. The gaping, empty hole in the sky said everything. Sarah walked over to the first stump, the one that had belonged to the largest oak, the captain of the old guard. She knelt in the sawdust, touching the raw wood. This is a tragedy, she whispered. This tree was at least 140 years old. Look at these rings, David. It survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and a century of coastal storms. And someone cut it down for a view? She spent the next 4 hours working with the precision of a crime scene investigator. She measured the diameter of every stump. She used a specialized probe to check the root systems. The surveyors, meanwhile, were pounding stakes into the dirt, confirming what I already knew. Sterling's crew hadn't just cut the trees. They had driven a 10-ton skid steer 3 feet onto my property to get a better angle for the saws. As they were finishing up, the front door of the glass mansion opened. Sterling came jogging down the hillside, still looking like he was in a luxury sportswear commercial. He looked annoyed, like he was dealing with a minor inconvenience. "Hey, Dave," he shouted, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "What's with the science fair? I told you I'd have my guys come by and clean up the mess. You don't need to hire your own crew." I didn't answer. I just stood there with my arms crossed. Sarah, however, stood up and wiped the sawdust from her pants. "Sir, I am a court-certified forensic arborist," she said, her voice ice cold. "I am currently documenting a criminal timber trespass. You are advised to return to your property immediately." Sterling laughed. It was that high-pitched, entitled giggle that makes you want to see someone lose everything. "Criminal? Come on. They're just trees. Look, Dave, I get it. You're sentimental. How much? 20 grand? 30? I'll write you a check right now, and we can call it a day. I'll even throw in some high-end privacy hedges for your side." Sarah looked at me, then back at Sterling. A thin, dangerous smile touched her lips. $20,000? "Sir, do you have any idea what the replacement value of a mature Garry Oak is?" Sterling shrugged. "I don't know, a couple thousand each. It's just wood." "Replacement value," Sarah said, tapping her tablet, "isn't the price of a sapling at a garden center. For a protected species of this age and size, we calculate the cost of sourcing a mature specimen, the cost of specialized cranes to transport and plant it, and the amenity value lost to the property owner. For each of these trees, the conservative estimate is $95,000. Sterling's smirk flickered. He started doing the math. 7 trees times 95,000. And that's just the base value, Sarah continued. In this state, when a timber trespass is willful, meaning you knew you didn't have permission and you did it anyway, the law allows for treble damages. That means 3 times the total value. The color finally drained from Sterling's face. His mouth hung open. 3 times? That's over $2 million. For some trees? That's insane. No judge is going to award that. Oh, they will. I finally spoke up, stepping forward into the light. But the money is the least of your problems, Sterling. I spent the morning looking at the coastal stability maps in my archive. Do you know why I never built a pool on that edge? Sterling stared at me, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. The Garry Oaks were the bio-anchors for this entire cliffside, I said, pointing to the slope where his massive, 10-ton concrete driveway sat just 20 feet away. Their root systems were an interconnected web that held the soil together. By killing them and ripping up the ground with your machinery, you've disturbed the structural integrity of the critical slope area. I paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. By the time the Department of Ecology and the Coastal Management Board get here tomorrow, they're going to realize that your $1 million driveway is now sitting on a ticking time bomb of unstable mud. You wanted a 180-degree view, Sterling. But you forgot that without the trees, the view might just come sliding down into the ocean, along with your house. Sterling looked at the stumps, then at his mansion, and then at me. For the first time, he didn't look like a tech mogul. He looked like a man standing on a sinking ship, realizing he'd just sold the lifeboats for a better seat at the table. "I'll fight you," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "I have more money than you'll ever see. I'll keep you in court until you're 90. "I'm a surveyor, Sterling," I said, turning to walk back toward my house. "I'm used to long-term projects. I hope you enjoy the view tonight. It might be the most expensive thing you ever look at." I walked inside and closed the door. I didn't feel happy. I felt a grim, architectural satisfaction. The demolition had begun, but not with a bulldozer. It had begun with a signature on a legal retainer. Tomorrow, the real landslide would start. And unlike the trees, I wasn't going to be easy to cut down. By the next morning, the silence between our properties was gone, replaced by the sound of rain, a steady, relentless Pacific Northwest drizzle. To most people, it was just weather. To me, it was the sound of gravity starting to collect its debt. Around 10 a.m., a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man in a 3-piece suit that looked like it cost more than my first 2 trucks. This wasn't Sterling. This was his attack dog. His lawyer, a man named Marcus Holloway. I knew the name. He was the kind of attorney who specialized in making problems disappear for the 1%. I met him on the porch. I didn't invite him in. "Mr. Daniels," Holloway said, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Vance. We'd like to resolve this misunderstanding quickly and quietly." My client is prepared to offer you a one-time settlement of $100,000. In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and a full release of all claims regarding the landscaping on the property line. I leaned against the porch railing, watching the rain drip off the roof. 100,000? That wouldn't even cover the tax on the treble damages for one of those oaks, Mr. Holloway. Holloway's eyes hardened. Mr. Daniels, let's be realistic. You're a retired surveyor living on a fixed income. A court battle with a man like Sterling Vance will take years and cost you hundreds of thousands in legal fees. By the time you see a dime, you'll be too old to enjoy it. Take the money. Buy a nice boat. Move on. It's not about the money, Holloway, I said, stepping closer. It's about the soil. Tell your client to look at his driveway. There's a hairline fracture starting near the north gate. It's about a 1/4 inch wide and 10 feet long. Holloway frowned, glancing towards Sterling's lot. What are you talking about? The old guard weren't just trees. They were a biological retaining wall, I explained, my voice dropping into a professional monotone. Without their root systems to drink the groundwater and anchor the topsoil, this entire cliffside has become a sponge. And sponges don't hold 10-ton concrete driveways very well. Holloway scoffed. If you're trying to scare us with doomsday geology, save it for the judge. My offer stands until 5 p.m. today. After that, we go to war. I've spent 40 years studying how land meets water. Marcus, I said as he turned to leave. I don't need to go to war. I just need to wait for the rain to finish the job. An hour after Holloway left, the real trouble arrived for Sterling. 2 white SUVs with Department of Ecology and Coastal Management Board decals pulled up. I had spent the previous night filing emergency reports, backed by my credentials as a licensed maritime surveyor. I watched from my window as 3 inspectors in high-visibility vests walked the property line. Sterling came out of his house, shouting and waving his arms. He tried the disruptor routine, talking over them, mentioning friends in high places, and calling the investigation a waste of taxpayer money. It didn't work. Government inspectors don't like being told how to do their jobs by a guy in a silk robe. I saw Sarah, the arborist from the day before, meet them at the stumps. She pointed to the exposed, shredded roots and then down at the saltwater inlet below. Muddy, brown water was already beginning to plume into the protected bay, a direct result of the unpermitted clearing and soil disturbance. One of the inspectors, a stern-looking man with a clipboard, walked up to Sterling and handed him a bright orange piece of paper. Even from 50 yards away, I knew what it was, a stop work order and a notice of violation. Sterling's infinity pool project was dead in the water. But that was just the appetizer. Later that afternoon, my lawyer Arthur Vance called. It's done, David. I've filed the lease pendants against the property title. I've also filed for an emergency injunction to freeze any further modifications to his lot. What does that mean for him? I asked. It means he's trapped, Arthur said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He can't sell that mansion. He can't get a loan against it. He can't even finish the interior work if it involves the structural integrity of the site. His $5 million asset just became a $5 million liability. And with the Department of Ecology involved, he's looking at federal fines that make my tree law fees look like pocket change. As the sun began to set, the rain intensified. I grabbed a flashlight and walked to the edge of my property, staying well back from the jagged stumps. I shone the light toward the property line. The fracture I'd mentioned to Holloway wasn't a 1/4 inch anymore. It was an inch wide, and it wasn't just 10 feet long. It had branched off, snaking its way directly toward the foundation of Sterling's glass-walled master suite. Without the trees to anchor the slope, the sheer weight of Sterling's vision was causing the land to creep. It was a slow-motion disaster, a structural collapse born of pure arrogance. Suddenly, the lights in Sterling's mansion flickered and died. A few seconds later, I heard the roar of a high-end backup generator kicking in. I looked up at the second floor. Sterling was standing there, silhouetted against the internal lights, staring down at the stumps of my trees. He wasn't holding a cup of espresso this time. He was leaning against the glass, his forehead pressed against the pane, looking like a prisoner in a very expensive cage. He wanted the view. Now, he was watching the very ground he thought he owned slide away into the dark. Sterling Vance thought he could buy the law, but he forgot that gravity doesn't take bribes. And in the Pacific Northwest, when the earth decides to move, not even $1 billion can tell it to stay put. They say that a man's home is his castle. But Sterling Vance forgot that even the strongest castle is worthless if the ground beneath it turns to soup. He thought his money could fight the law, but he was about to find out that no amount of Silicon Valley stock can stop 500 tons of saturated Pacific mud from following the laws of physics. The storm was coming, and I wasn't just watching the weather report. I was watching the clock on his final downfall. The rain didn't stop. In the Pacific Northwest, we call this a pineapple express, a warm, moisture-laden atmospheric river that dumps inches of rain in a matter of hours. For most people, it means leaky roofs and flooded basements. For Sterling Vance, it was the final architectural verdict. That Tuesday evening, while the wind howled through the empty space where my oaks used to stand, I heard a frantic pounding on my front door. It wasn't the rhythmic, professional knock of a lawyer. It was the desperate, heavy thud of someone who had run out of options. I opened the door to find Sterling. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive linen shirt clinging to his chest, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked older, shrunken. Behind him, the generator in his dark mansion was screaming, a mechanical death rattle in the gale. "You have to stop them," he gasped, pushing his way into my foyer. I stepped back, keeping my hands visible. "Stop who, Sterling? The clouds? I told you, I'm a surveyor, not a weather god." "The city. The inspectors," he shouted, his voice cracking. "They just issued an unsafe to occupy notice. They're telling me I have to evacuate. They're shutting off the main gas line because the ground shift is putting too much tension on the pipes. They're red tagging my house, Dave." "It's David," I said quietly. "And they aren't doing that because they want to. They're doing it because your driveway is currently 6 inches lower than it was yesterday morning. The structural integrity you bragged about, it's gone. You removed the bio-anchors, and now the hillside is reclaiming the space." Sterling grabbed the edge of my hallway table, his knuckles white. "I'll give you the $1 million. Right now. I'll sign over the cash. Just tell your lawyer to drop the lease pendants. Tell the inspectors it was a mistake, that the trees weren't that important. You're the expert, right? They'll listen to you." I looked at him, and for a second, I felt a flicker of pity, not for the man, but for the sheer, blinding ignorance of his worldview. He truly thought that even at the edge of a literal landslide, a checkbook could fix the earth. "It's too late for $1 million, Sterling," I said. "The Department of Ecology has already documented the silt runoff into the protected spawning grounds below. That's a federal violation of the Coastal Zone Management Act. The fines alone will exceed 7 figures. And my tree lawsuit? Arthur just added a claim for loss of quiet enjoyment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're looking at close to $3 million now." Sterling's eyes went wide. $3 million? I don't have that kind of liquid cash tied up. My assets are in the house. My wealth is in the property. That's the beauty of a lease pendants, I said, leaning against the wall. Your wealth is frozen in a house that the city just declared a death trap. You can't sell it, you can't rent it, and you can't insure it. Who's going to buy a red tag mansion on a sliding cliff with a multi-million-dollar lien on the title? Suddenly, a massive crack echoed through the night. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of reinforced concrete snapping. We both froze. Sterling turned and ran to the porch. I followed him, grabbing a high-powered spotlight from the coat rack. I shone the beam across the property line. The sight was devastating. Sterling's 10-ton concrete driveway, the one he built to showcase his G-Wagon, had split down the middle. A massive section of it had dropped 3 feet, leaving a jagged edge of rebar and broken stone. The mud beneath it was moving like a slow, dark river, flowing directly into the void where the old guard's roots used to be. "My house," Sterling whispered, staring as the crack snaked its way toward the foundation of his glass master suite. "Everything I built, it's all there." "You didn't build it on land, Sterling," I said, the wind whipping my words away. "You built it on ego. And ego has a very poor shear strength." Just then, a city marshal's car pulled into the gable lot, its blue lights reflecting off the pouring rain. A man with a megaphone stepped out. "Mr. Vance, you are in violation of a mandatory evacuation order. This site is unstable. Move to the designated safe zone immediately." Sterling looked at me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated defeat. He looked at his vision, now a dark, cracking monument to his own greed. Then he looked at the stumps of my oaks. "I just wanted the view," he whimpered. "You got it," I said. "You have a perfectly unobstructed view of your own ruin. Now get off my porch before I call the marshal for trespassing." He stumbled down the steps, disappearing into the rain and the blue flashing lights. I watched him go, then I turned back to my quiet, cedar-shingled house. The storm was still raging, but I knew my home would stand. My foundation was deep, anchored by 20 years of respect for the land. Sterling's disruption was finally over. The land was winning, but I wasn't finished. There was one more legal maritime card I had to play, a card that would ensure that when the dust or the mud finally settled, Sterling Vance wouldn't just be homeless. He would be my tenant. They say that land is the only thing that lasts, but they forget that land is alive. It breathes, it moves, and it remembers. Sterling Vance thought he could own the coast by cutting down its guardians. He thought he could buy his way out of a landslide. But as the sun rose over the wreckage of the storm, he realized that in the eyes of the law and the eyes of nature, he was nothing but a squatter on a shifting cliff. Here is how I didn't just win a lawsuit. I won the very ground he stood on. The morning after the storm was eerily beautiful. The Pacific Northwest sky was a pale, translucent blue, and the air felt crisp and scrubbed clean. But the beauty was a mask for the devastation on the Gable lot. I stood on my deck, coffee in hand, looking at the unobstructed view Sterling had wanted so badly. He got it. But the view now included a 15-foot-wide chasm where his luxury driveway used to be. The foundation of his glass-walled master suite was partially exposed, hanging over a raw, muddy cliff like a tooth pulled halfway out of a socket. Around 11 a.m., a bright yellow truck from a major insurance company pulled up. Out stepped an adjuster in a hard hat. He spent 30 minutes walking the perimeter of Sterling's lot, shaking his head and taking photos. Sterling was right there beside him, gesturing wildly, likely pleading for a total loss payout. I walked down to the property line, just close enough to hear the conversation. "Mr. Vance," the adjuster said, his voice loud enough to carry in the still morning air. "I've reviewed the preliminary report from the Department of Ecology and the forensic arborist. Your policy has a very specific exclusion for willful acts and illegal modifications." "What does that mean?" Sterling barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "It means," the adjuster said, closing his folder with a snap, "that because the slope failure was a direct result of the illegal and unpermitted removal of protected heritage trees, an act you personally authorized, this is not an act of God. It's an act of negligence. Your claim is denied. Every cent of the stabilization and demolition costs is on you." Sterling staggered back, hitting the side of his G-Wagon. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His $5 million mansion was now a $5 million pile of unsellable glass and concrete, and no insurance company on earth was going to touch it. But I wasn't done with him. Not yet. A week later, we were in a mediation room at the county courthouse. Sterling looked like a ghost. He was wearing a cheap suit, his eyes sunken and dark. His lawyer, Holloway, didn't look so smooth anymore. On my side sat Arthur Vance, looking like a shark that had just found a wounded whale. "Let's be brief," Arthur said, sliding a thick document across the table. "The total judgment for the timber trespass, including treble damages, loss of property value, and emotional distress, is $2.4 million. The Department of Ecology is fine-tuning their fines, but it's looking like another $600,000 for the coastal spawning ground contamination." Sterling put his head in his hands. "I don't have it. My assets are frozen. The bank is already starting foreclosure on the lot because the red tagging triggered a default on the construction loan. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. My Maritime masterstroke. I have a counteroffer," I said, speaking for the first time. Sterling looked up, a tiny spark of hope in his eyes. "I'm a Maritime surveyor, Sterling. I know that because of the landslide you caused, the high water mark of the protected inlet has effectively shifted. Your lot is no longer developable land under the new coastal zoning laws. It's now a restoration zone." I leaned forward, looking him dead in the eye. "I will buy your debt from the bank. I've already been in talks with them. They want to get this toxic asset off their books. In exchange for you signing over the deed to me today, right now, I will drop the $2.4 million suit. You take your personal belongings, you take your car, and you walk away. No more lawyers, no more fines, no more jail time for the criminal timber trespass." Sterling looked at Holloway. Holloway slowly nodded. "It's the only way you don't end up in prison or bankrupt for the next 40 years, Sterling." Sterling Vance, the disruptor, the tech millionaire, the man who always got what he wanted, picked up a pen with a shaking hand. He signed the deed. He signed over the Gable lot, the house, the mud, the view, to me. As he walked out of the room, he stopped and looked at me. "Why? You hate the house. You hate what I did. Why do you want it?" "I don't want the house, Sterling," I said, putting the deed into my briefcase. "I'm an architect of the land. I'm going to tear that concrete bunker down. I'm going to stabilize the slope. And then, I'm going to plant 7 new Garry Oaks. They'll take 100 years to grow," Sterling hissed. "I know," I smiled. "And I'm going to enjoy every single second of the first few inches." 1 year later, the Sterling Vance mansion is gone. It took 6 months of careful, surgical demolition to remove the glass and concrete without causing further slides. I spent a fortune on riprap, native grasses, and specialized erosion control blankets. But today, the hillside is quiet again. The eagles have returned. And at the edge of the property line, 7 young, healthy Garry Oak saplings are stretching their leaves toward the Pacific sun. I'm 70 now. I won't live to see these trees reach the sky. I won't see them become the old guard. But that's the thing about being an architect of the truth. You don't build for yourself. You build for the future. Sterling? Last I heard, he's living in a studio apartment in a landlocked city, working as a consultant for a firm that hates him. He doesn't have a view of the water anymore. He has a view of a brick wall. And me? I'm sitting on my wraparound porch, Buster at my feet, watching the tide come in. The land is at peace. The debt is paid. And the old guard is back on duty. Thanks for staying until the very end of this journey. This story reminds us that while money can disrupt many things, it can never disrupt the laws of nature and the power of a patient man with a plan. If you felt that justice was served today, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and join the ThreadVerse community. Smash that like button to help the algorithm find others who need a reminder that arrogance always has a price. And leave a comment below. If a neighbor cut down your trees, would you have gone for the money, or would you have gone for the land like Mark did? I read every single one of your responses. Stay loyal, stay sharp, and remember, the land always remembers where the boundaries are. I'll see you in the next one.